Hello everyone, Books with Banks back again, and today's video is going to be a little bit different, but first and foremost, I'm so pleased to announce that I finally picked up with Gabaldon's Outlander series again. I finished book 4, Drums of Autumn, last fall, and this past week or so I've just started book 5, The Fiery Cross. A light spoiler warning before we get into it, but I'll try to remain pretty vague when I can, because this video isn't so much about the particular plot and character developments at the beginning of this book, but rather it's about why Gabaldon might have chosen to open this 1,400-page novel with more than 200 pages, all taking place over the course of one long day. I should also say that a year or two ago, I was flying home to visit with family and friends, and a flight attendant saw I was reading one of the earlier novels in the series, so she and I got to talking about the books, the TV show, and so on, but this flight attendant said she was on book 5, and she said something to the effect of, when you get to the 5th one, don't bother reading the first few hundred pages, it's slow and nothing happens. She said something like that. And now if you go to places like Reddit or Goodreads or even other YouTube channels, you can pretty quickly find yourself someone talking about how much of a slog this opening longest day section is, or sequence is. Here is kind of that much of the book. Yeah, and some fans extend that criticism to the entirety of book 5. On the flip side, however, the other day I found an older Reddit thread of fans listing off their favorite scenes and moments from specifically the longest day section. So this part of the book does have its supporters and fans in and of itself, sort of like a novella within the larger novel. And if I haven't been clear about exactly what this scene is, or what this whole section is about, here goes. Book 5, Fiery Cross, mass market paperback, is 1,443 pages long. The first 244 pages, this part 1, all takes place over the course of one long day in which several Scottish settlers in colonial America, 1770, are attending a gathering where all the Scottish families in the area come together for a days-long event leading up to and through celebrations, things like weddings, sporting events, christenings, kind of like a massive family reunion for the Scottish settlers in North Carolina, or in the North Carolina colony at this time. So, the longest day opens with our main couple, Claire and Jamie, waking up on the final day of the gathering, and then Gabaldon dives into a thorough exploration of what 3 or 4 different POV characters are up to over the course of that day, encapsulating comic misunderstandings with a thief catcher, things like British soldiers looking for fugitives from a recent violent riot, several scenes of surgery, a few truths being revealed between lovers, and concerns raised over having young children and whether or not and how soon to have more children. Also, what gifts to get a bride or a groom on their wedding day. Also, a lot of questions about getting married by a Catholic priest, or getting married if you're a Presbyterian, and Catholicism, Protestantism. Interesting conversations abound. I'll also add that, as you can see here, all of these books are already broken up into parts. Here, I'll show you the kind of part opening. Part 1 in medias res. And yeah, so while the longest day, that might be kind of the colloquial name for the opening section amongst fans, Gabaldon has titled this section in medias res. An important point that we'll come back to at the end of my video. So, what did I think of the section? Was it an effective opening, or a long-winded, bloated, tiresome read? I actually quite enjoyed it. I think part of my main enjoyment was just the sheer joy I have getting to see all of these characters again, getting back into this world. Additionally, I've watched the first 6 seasons of the show, and those go well past this point. If I remember correctly, a version of this section makes up basically the first episode of, I think, season 5. Some characters are slightly changed, some left out entirely. Some of the smaller little comedic episodes and scenes here in the book don't make it into the show at all, which makes sense, of course. Trying to cram 244 pages of anything into an hour of television is pretty impossible. In short, I think my personal enjoyment of The Longest Day has a lot to do with all of the new discoveries I'm making and how I'm reading about several side characters and plot lines for the first time, things that didn't make it onto the show. If you've watched a couple of my videos about Game of Thrones, where I've talked about the book series Song of Ice and Fire, you'll know that Book 4, A Feast for Crows, is my favorite one of those, probably because I read it at a time when the show hadn't caught up to that book yet, so it was all fresh, and the opening here gives a lot of fresh and exciting interactions for me to read about in a very similar way. If I was reading this book when it first came out, way before the show started, then my thoughts might be a little bit different. Now, let's talk about whether or not The Longest Day, or In Medias Res, is slow. There are so many factors that can contribute to a book's pace, but the first thing I really try to think about and look at is I ask myself the simple question, is the scene being described to me, are those events likely to play out in a shorter or longer time than it's actually taking me to read the scene? If the events are much shorter, like 2 pages about 2 characters walking into a room and saying hello to each other, well, yeah, then it's a bit of a slower pace. Not necessarily bad or unimportant, but definitely slower. On this test, this metric, I would actually say that The Longest Day, while certainly long, is not slow. Gabaldon makes sure to make all of her characters and various POVs extremely busy, like there's a crisis or near crisis that needs to be dealt with at all times. So even when we're inside a character's head for a few paragraphs, even if they're thinking about something that's not happening in the moment, it's while they're hiking over to someone's tent, or maybe while they're trying to concentrate on a difficult surgery, things like that. And that actually brings me to my next point. All of the different characters. Over the course of this section, we spend most of our time in Claire's head, but we get a few POV shifts to Roger, then a couple to Brianna, and then even one to Jamie. So that much page time and the day's activities all spread out between 4 different characters, it's actually not so bad. And a lot of times when we return to one POV or another, Gabaldon is catching us up on what that person's been up to in the meantime, what we've missed over there in that side of the gathering. Now, let's talk about the structure. And here we have some pros and cons, and I can start to see why some fans and readers might get a little frustrated, specifically with how the chapters are laid out. There are about 16 chapters here, most of which clock in around 10 pages in the mass market. That said, the first chapter, I believe, is about 50 pages long, and then there's one near the end that's a similar, almost 50-page length. These chapters have the occasional break and scene switch within them, but usually not many of those. So while the stretches of 5 to 10 page chapters, those can fly by, an easy read right before bed. Those longer chapters, if you get to one of those, I can understand why those could be sort of stumbling blocks for some readers. Another point working against the pacing of the story within a story is kind of the actual significance of the events at hand. In a lot of ways, this long day feels almost like the conclusion of tensions built up across several storylines from the previous book, and we're building towards 2 big weddings after all. Meanwhile, Gabaldon's slowly but surely introducing new tensions, now with the governor having first soldiers asking Scotsmen to turn each other in if they know of anyone participating in violent riots, and second, the governor asking Jamie to start recruiting for a militia to fight for the crown and resist rumors of these regulators, basically early revolutionaries in North Carolina. Now, the most dramatic, most exciting scenes don't happen in this 200-page stretch, so I can understand somebody maybe having read this wanting something a little bit bigger, something that maybe shifted the direction of the book a little more dramatically. Maybe you're hoping for something like that from such a lengthy sequence, and you don't quite get that because it's a lot about tying up the last book and setting up this next book. So The Longest Day, I think, can be viewed as a sort of bridging novella. Again, tying up loose ends, having important conversations to address the events of the previous book, while simultaneously introducing the tensions and driving forces behind the drama to come in this book. But the drama that's not quite here yet. And having so many characters crammed together in one place at one time, Gabaldon gives herself the perfect opportunity to wrap up and introduce whatever storyline she needs to. Last but definitely not least, let's talk about style and theme. When I approach an analysis of not even a whole book, but a section like this, and I try to think about the style and the approach the author took, it's still ultimately most important to ask myself why. Why has Gabaldon chosen to do this, to write this section like this? And then whatever answers I can come up with, those will usually help me to start appreciating the story more and more. So the first answer, the first reason I can think of is 1, Drums of Autumn, Book 4, came out in 1996. Fiery Cross, this one, came out 5 years later in 2001. So Gabaldon had to catch up readers after 5 years on where she left things off. So yes, going straight from Drums into this, or even maybe having watched a lot of the show lately and then reading this, I can see how some might feel it's a bit redundant, covering much of the same ground and circling around the same conversations and ideas at the end of the last book. Being a father to a son, that's not necessarily yours. Also things like Jocasta Cameron's heavy-handed political games. Also things like the fears in time travelers, or the fears that a time traveler's knowledge of the impending revolution. We circle back around to catch up on all of that. But reason 2, kind of another answer that I come up with of why Gabaldon might have written this scene like, or this sequence like she did. It's the plethora of main and side characters present here at this gathering, and presumably many of the side characters involved in those mini dramas and comedic misunderstandings and surgeries and whatnot. I assume, now that we know James Fraser has invited others to come settle at the Ridge, and also now that we know our Frasers are needing to social network more and make places for themselves in the broader community, one can assume that Gabaldon is taking this opening to introduce much of the cast that will probably be important for the rest of the novel, so that when those characters, those side characters, do show up again, we already have a connection with them, a little episodic memory of them from this gathering. In that way, this opening serves as a sort of dramatis personae, but instead of just a list of important characters, Gabaldon gets to introduce them in a more organic way while still telling her story. The best comparison I can think of is actually the film The Godfather, where we open on a wedding day, very similar to here, and extended family are swirling around the event, and we get to meet them and see all of their unique interactions and tensions. And honestly, Jamie does have a bit of a Godfather vibe about him, being the master of a large plot of land that others will soon be moving towards. There's also a lot about his soon-to-be son-in-law and the responsibilities and inheritance this son-in-law will have to assume eventually, all very similar to ideas at the beginning of The Godfather, things like Sonny being primed and prepped to inherit his father's role. Now, obviously, the story of that film goes in a much different direction than the Outlander series. I'm not saying Roger is anything like Sonny or Michael for that matter, but when I asked myself why put such a massive opening scene like this right at the beginning of the book, my answer kept coming back to how well it worked for Coppola in Godfather, and how structurally similar, or at least how similar the intention is, introducing us to this family and almost all the side characters who will eventually wind up stumbling back into the story along the rest of the way. And I think Gabaldon did this brilliantly. And then the third and final why of it all, and this comes back to the official title of the section, In Medias Res, Latin for in the middle of things. As mentioned, these gatherings are several days long, and we're dropped right in on the last day at the moment when most of the celebrations and most exciting events are about to take place. And in dropping us in like this, Gabaldon needed to be prepared to describe and explore all manner of various 1770s era appropriate situations, and as she always does, I'm sure she did extensive research into the time period and what a gathering like this would have been like at the time. Then, having done all that research, she can't just jump over to a scene of, say, Claire pulling out someone's tooth without maybe flexing a little bit about all of the work that's gone into researching how such a thing was done back then. Now, as someone who studies history, someone really fascinated by microhistories or the history of these smaller everyday life experiences, as opposed to the epic movements and like politics of kings and wars and whatnot, for someone like myself, more interested in the minutiae, in this sort of thing, reading several pages about the way these surgeries are performed is absolutely riveting. Also reading many sections about things like what women could try to use for birth control back then. I find it so fascinating, so cool. So in a lot of ways, I'm kind of the perfect audience for lengthier and detailed discussions and explorations of these historical aspects, but I can definitely understand someone reading this maybe not being quite as into the detailed research of the minutiae of everyday life. Maybe some fans really enjoyed the history stuff in Scotland and France, but US history has never been your thing. Maybe you're not that big of a history fan at all, but more interested in the romance, and there's not a ton of like explicit scenes of intimacy at the beginning here. In fact, there's a couple moments I can think of, but both times it's sort of like a fade to black and then conversation after the fact. So yeah, this opening might not do the trick for the readers that are really here for the romance. Also, maybe you are into history, but after the excitement at the end of book 4, you were hoping for more of a continuation into exciting action with like the indigenous tribes, the Native American stuff that was set up in the 4th one, or maybe you were hoping for more of a focus on the early murmurings of revolution. Maybe you were hoping for more of a time jump, or at least quicker progress up to the beginning of the revolution. Unfortunately, that's not what this Longest Day is really about. Again, those revolution kind of tensions are woven throughout the sequence of scenes, but it's not the main focus. Yeah. And at the end of the day, in short, my analysis brings me to this. Gabaldon opens Book 5 in her epic Outlander series, The Fiery Cross, with a 200-plus page deep dive into a hectic day-in-the-life sequence to catch up readers on what our main cast has been up to introduce us to many new, potentially important side characters and plot threads that will likely be significant parts of the rest of the novel. And she does this also to provide readers with a clear and detailed snapshot of what several smaller historical aspects of life would have actually been like in North Carolina in 1770. I feel like I've addressed exactly why I found The Longest Day so enjoyable, but I hope I've also helped to explain why others might not. Needless to say, I'm excited to keep reading this book to see how well all of these introductions are brought back around into the later parts of the story. I'm so happy to be back immersing myself in Gabaldon's rich world. But that should do it for today. Thank you all so much for watching. Have a good day. Bye.